So let's begin with a basic look at the overall layout design. You may have seen this plan before, but you can see that the overall size here is 25 feet 10 inches by 12 foot 6 inches. That gives a total of 46,500 square inches, or 29.994 square meters, which, if you've seen the previous videos, may give you a clue that I need to be under 30 square meters total floor area in order to satisfy building control. The entrance door here is to the left, and you enter the shed with a duck under. The boards will be set at 48 inches, which is a little higher than my previous layout, and that duck under worked perfectly well, so I'm quite happy at 48 inches as a board height. The overall design has a main circuit around the walls, with a central peninsula carrying the city terminus and the branch. On the main circuit, the storage is along the top edge as you look at the plan, with the junction station on the other. And the main control point here will be at Yarslow in the lower operating aisle. Now, details of control of this layout are going to be covered in a future video, but for now I should point out that the whole layout is designed for one-man operation. So you'll see in that lower aisle you have a control panel for Yarslow. There is what's called the master cab control panel, which I'll explain later. You can see a control panel for Trinity Square, and probably to the right in front of the Trinity Square loco shed will be some duplicate controls that will operate the points in the storage area. Those of you who are familiar with my ideas around conceptual layout design will recognize that this layout has an OII shape. That is a continuous run with two end-to-end bits, one of them being the city terminus and the other being the branch. And the whole point of this is that I wanted the layout to give me the ability to make a journey. And so when we look at this layout in detail, what we're going to do is to actually go on that journey from a town called Midworth, which is actually off stage, right round to High Marsh, which is also off stage, but actually up the branch. So we're going to come into the city and then out via Trinity Square and Yarslow along the branch and into High Marsh, which is the storage sidings that you can see. But before we do that, let me give you a quick tour of my modelling routes so that you can understand why this layout will exist at all. For me, it all started here, the Railway Modeller, February 1972. This changed my entire outlook on trains. Up until then, I'd messed around with toy trains. Now all of a sudden there were pictures and diagrams and articles on detailed models. The layout of the month was Jeff Mawson's loft system. Not just a circular track and a few sidings, a whole system of stations and places and trains that went from one place to another. And there was part two of Bill Hudson's Ashover layout. Again, real trains doing real things. It didn't take me long to send off and get January 1972 to see the first part of Bill Hudson's Ashover layout, and plenty of other things as well. My collection of the Railway Modeller magazine from January 1972 to date is unbroken. Featured in the early pages of the Railway Modeller, and rapidly becoming one of my favourite layouts, was Peter Denny's Buckingham Great Central. It would take me a few years to work out why it was one of my favourites, and it wasn't until I discovered, in fact, that I wanted to be able to make journeys on layouts. Buckingham allowed you to do that. You travelled from the storage sidings into the terminus, and from the terminus up the branch. The whole layout had a purpose. This started to ring lots of bells with me, and you can see that that desire to go on a journey survives to this day. Latterly, I've discovered the O-gauge layout at Gainsborough, recreation of an entire main line, and what a great place to go and visit. Again, a system, again the ability to make journeys. This was all suddenly beginning to be very real for me. So let's break the layout down into its constituent parts and let's take that journey. And we're going to start at Midworth. Now of course Midworth doesn't exist and it isn't featured on the layout as a scenic section. It just happens to be the point at which the outer suburban trains from Trinity Square terminate. Trinity Square of course being the secondary terminus in the city of Beckbridge. Now this is a rather truncated view of the Midworth storage sidings, but they're actually the 6 or 7 pieces of sidings that you can see at the front of the storage area. There's also the spare locomotive yard on the right hand side. Each of the sidings here is designed to hold one train, so you'll see that there are a number of suburban train sidings, there's a parcels siding, there's a vans siding for a trip working that comes across from the Beckbridge main storage yard. And the system here for operation is quite simple. The train arrives from Trinity Square, clearly with a locomotive at the front, runs into the siding where there is a dead end isolator section at the end. Bear in mind this is a DC layout. The uncoupling ramps between the tracks uncouple the engine from the coaches, and then another engine comes out of the storage yard and couples on the other end for the train's return. Each of the sidings is long enough to hold an engine, the rolling stock and an engine on the other end. What I'll come back to a little later is the dark brown siding on the bottom left, which is actually not a siding at all, so just ignore that for the time being, and as I say, we'll come back to that later. Now you'll notice there's a control panel here. It's not my intention to get up and walk around and work the trains into Trinity Square from this control panel unless I'm operating a full system. The idea is that if I'm working at my workbench, then I'll have the ability to run trains in and out of main storage and this bit won't work. But if I have the luxury of more than one operator, somebody can be stationed here and that control panel will work the points of the main storage and of course allow the operator to bring trains into this area from Trinity Square and do the hot shoe shuffle thing with the engine on the other end of the train. Now trains that leave the storage sidings for Trinity Square travel in a clockwise direction around the yellow section and pass over Middle Junction. Now this name comes from a previous layout and it's just stuck, but you can see this is a close-up of Middle Junction. The turntable from the loco yard is top left, and you'll see that trains come round on the yellow section. They have the ability to access the main line should they want, but in normal circumstances they would simply travel to the left of the main line here and then run onto the green lines, which are the approach to Trinity Square. The line incidentally going across over the top is the branch, which we'll come to later. And so on our suburban train we arrive from Midworth and we come bottom right on the approach tracks under the road overbridge and under the signal gantry, past the loco shed and eventually into Beckbridge Trinity Square, or just Trinity Square station. Now this is an unashamed copy, lift, heavily influenced by, whichever way you want to look at it, Cyril Freezer's Minories branch, which first appeared in a track plans book probably in the 1960s. Now this in essence is a very simple station. It's a facing and a trailing crossover, and then the line is just divided into 2 main platforms, a branch or goods yard depending on which version you're building, and there's a loco spur on the north side of the station. Very simple, and if we go back to Trinity Square you'll see this design is perpetuated. Now you'll see that my design is somewhat complicated by the fact that there is a run round / storage track between the 2 main platforms. The loco spur has been converted into a full-blown platform. The goods yard is slightly different, and there is a locomotive depot separate on the way in, but essentially it's still Minories, and anybody looking at this who knows the original Cyril Freezer design will probably say, oh, it comes from Minories, because you can see the obvious links. Because the layout is DC operated, you'll see there's a number of subsections here so that trains can be held and isolated and locomotives can be stored, and that's fine. The actual main area is divided up into two, I guess what DCC users would call power districts. There's the light green, which is the station itself, and then the darker green colour, which is the small yard at the bottom, and this is where the vans train comes into play. There will be a vans trip coming across from Beckbridge Central, pulls into the goods reception road, which is also platform 4, and then there'll be a shunter on hand to shuffle the vans around. Platform 1 is probably going to be reserved for parcels traffic, and the suburban and other passenger services will use platforms 2 and 3. Now, before we go any further, let me just say that I've borrowed a couple of photographs off the internet here purely for entertainment and education purposes. The owners of these layouts are not aware that I've used these pictures. They're just there to illustrate a point I'm trying to make, and this is the first one, which is this is the kind of feel that I expect Trinity Square to have. And this is a photograph from one of the manufacturer's catalogues showing that there are plastic kits around for oil tanks, which I'm going to use in the loco depot, but I'm going to try to use as many proprietary kits as possible. Clearly it's a big layout, there will be buildings that I have to make, but if there's something available I can use, I'm going to use it. So having arrived at Trinity Square from Midworth on a suburban train, we're going to get a mainline train. The service is called the Coastal, which runs from Trinity Square up the coastal route through Yarslow up to Northborough. And this is what it might look like. It's probably in the hands of one of the 264 tanks standards. It'll be mainline coaches, and we're going to take this and go as far as Yarslow. So we go out of Trinity Square, this time on the green lines, back through Middle Junction, and then back through the storage sidings. And you'll see, as shown on this particular diagram, that on the outside of the storage loops there is a red track on the outside and a blue track on the inside. And these are the through routes so that trains can run around the layout without troubling the storage areas in between. So our particular coastal train is travelling from right to left here on the blue line through the storage sidings and then disappearing bottom left hand side. Now the train first appears on the scenic section here on the blue line. This is passing over the door and on the approach to Yarslow, and at Yarslow there used to be an old wagon works where private owner wagons were serviced and repaired, and obviously with the demise of the private owner wagon fleets these little yards closed down, but some of them were taken over by the permanent way department, and that's the case at Yarslow. So you'll see here that the old repair shop and the old paint shop and the old forge in fact have been taken over and now form part of the permanent way yard. You'll see there's a facing crossover between the red and the blue lines. That's there to allow trains to go back onto storage if they're travelling around on the red line. I'll come onto that bit in a little bit later. And again, this is a proprietary kit. This is a garage, I think, but it's the ideal sort of thing that I can use to sneak in as the old paint store. So again, I'm going to use buildings that exist rather than having to build them. And so here we are, arriving at Yarslow from the bottom right hand corner on the blue line and calling at the platforms. You'll see there are slightly different coloured mainline bits in the platforms, both up and down. We're travelling down here, and that's to allow trains to be, or engines to be isolated, so that if needs be the station pilot can add or detract wagons from the back of them. Again, bear in mind this is a DC layout. So having got off our train will depart. It'll continue travelling in an anti-clockwise direction around the blue line, disappearing bottom left, and eventually going back into storage. And in this particular case, the coastal is stored in those end-on sidings that we looked at first of all as part of the storage siding. We're going to change platforms. We're going to go on to the very light blue lines here, and we're going to get the DMU, which runs up the branch, and you can see that it will run out of the platform. It'll run through the two single slips to the top left corner past the loco shed, rising all the time and going around the branch to the bottom left hand corner. And before we leave Yarslow, we ought to make note that there are some loops on the inside for trains to terminate or reverse. The two sidings next to the platform are in fact exchange sidings for freight off the branch. And then there are 2 or 3 sidings just for local traffic, so there's a coal siding and a couple of wagon sidings. Please excuse the fact that all the writing here is upside down. I've simply turned the plan upside down for use to make it easier for you to see. On the branch line, you'll see there is far left hand corner, there is a loco shed and coal stage for the branch engine, and there's a small factory at the back in the centre. As far as all the colours are concerned, well, these are simply the sections that the track is broken down into. I'm going to do a video on the cab control system to explain how that works for DC layouts and how different operators can access different bits of track when they need to. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming your way in a little while. And thus our DMU arrives along the branch, in this case from the right hand side on the orange line, appearing on the scene over a level crossing and passing a factory called Row Boxes, again a name that survived plenty of layouts of mine, where there is a small works halt. Quick divergence here just to show you what the Row Boxes approach might look like. So this is what I think the entrance to the scenic section at Row Boxes will look like. Our train will appear on scene from the left between the 2 buildings, over the level crossing and into the small station come factory complex on the right hand side. Again, Rob Rowland's work is copyrighted. I've just borrowed this picture off the internet for education purposes. I would certainly look up Rob Rowland, because if all of his pictures are of this kind of quality, he's very much worth a look. So having passed Row Boxes, we then pass some kind of scenic break, which may be a small tunnel, it may be a viaduct over a stream yet, and we end up in the station of Butterbump and Mumby. And if you think that's a bit of a strange name for a station, let me just show you an ancient map of North Lincolnshire. So here we are in North Lincolnshire, and you can see just north of Cumberworth is a little village of Mumby, and to the south of Cumberworth is a farm that was called Butterbump. And so we go through the very simple Butterbump and Mumby station, where there is a signal box and some signals because it is going to be a section post, and eventually we run off to the left here into the storage yards, which represent the terminus at Highmarsh. And this in fact is the only bit of the layout that actually exists. This was built for another layout and has been rescued. It's a 4-track traverser, well actually a 5-track traverser, because you can see one of them actually divides, and this is going to represent the end of the line and the end of our journey from Midworth via Trinity Square round to Yarslow and down to Highmarsh. Now before we go, let me take you back to that brown siding that I mentioned right at the beginning. You'll see on this big plan here that it's bottom left of the storage sidings. This in fact is a cartridge for those trains that don't run very often and which I don't want to have parked in sidings doing nothing potentially for a very long time. The cartridge will be put onto where that brown siding is. It runs onto the yellow line, and then from there can either go in the up or down direction, so either clockwise or anti-clockwise. Let's assume that it goes clockwise, so it runs along the yellow line through Middle Junction onto the main line, round perhaps to Yarslow. It might run through Yarslow platforms. Let's assume it's perhaps some empty pigeon stock. It then runs round past the permanent way yard, but it's got to get back onto the inside of the storage area to get back to that cartridge, and that's where the facing crossover comes in. Now this facing crossover is going to be hidden from view by the buildings of the permanent way yard, and the half of it's going to be out of the scenic section anyway, but it runs through the facing crossover round onto the blue line, through the blue storage sidings, in fact going the wrong way, and then using that crossover at the bottom of the blue line back onto the yellow, where it can then reverse back onto the cartridge. A little bit complicated, but it's a great way of having trains that only run from time to time and not use up your space. So there we are, we've made a journey around the layout, and it's given us a chance to show you basically how it's going to hang together. For the minute, apart from that traverser for Highmarsh and things like this pile of points waiting to be used, the layout doesn't exist. I'm waiting for the big start date, which hopefully will be in the new year. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you soon.